In 1862, during the height of the Civil War, New Orleans found itself under Union occupation. The city's French Quarter buzzed with an unusual mixture of federal soldiers, displaced plantation owners, and freed slaves navigating their new reality. Among the grand mansions on Royal Street stood the Beauregard estate, a three-story Creole townhouse with cast-iron balconies that had witnessed decades of prosperity built on human bondage. The Union Army had established a makeshift medical facility in the mansion's lower floors, treating wounded soldiers and civilians alike. It was here that Army surgeon Dr. Marcus Whitfield first encountered what would become the most perplexing case of his career. On a humid September morning, a young woman was brought to the makeshift hospital by two Union soldiers who had found her collapsed near the levee. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark skin that suggested African heritage. She wore the simple cotton dress of a house servant, though it bore no identification of which household she belonged to. What immediately caught Dr. Whitfield's attention was not her unconscious state, but the series of what appeared to be healed wounds across her arms and back. The scars formed unusual patterns, as if someone had methodically inflicted injuries that had somehow healed with impossible speed and precision. When the woman regained consciousness 3 days later, she spoke in a mixture of French and broken English, identifying herself only as Celeste. She claimed no memory of how she had come to be near the levee, nor could she explain the extensive scarring on her body. Dr. Whitfield noted in his medical journal that the scars appeared to be of different ages, some clearly recent while others seemed years old, yet all showed signs of healing that defied conventional understanding of human physiology. The mystery deepened when Dr. Whitfield attempted to examine Celeste more thoroughly. During his examination, he discovered that several wounds that should have taken weeks to heal had closed overnight. A deep laceration on her forearm that he had cleaned and bandaged the previous evening appeared as nothing more than a thin red line by morning. The doctor initially attributed this to his own fatigue and possible misremembering, but when the phenomenon repeated itself over the following days, he began to document everything meticulously. Before the war had disrupted the social order of New Orleans, Celeste's daily existence had been governed by the rigid hierarchy of plantation life. According to fragmentary records discovered years later in the estate's archives, she had been born on the Treme plantation, approximately 15 miles upriver from the city. The plantation records, maintained with typical antebellum precision, showed her birth as occurring in 1840, making her 22 years old at the time of her appearance at the Union Medical Facility. The Treme plantation had been owned by the Boudreau family for 3 generations. Jean-Baptiste Boudreau, the patriarch, maintained detailed logs of his human property, noting not only births and deaths, but also the specific skills and physical condition of each enslaved person. Celeste's entry in these records described her as exceptionally resilient, and noted her assignment to the main house at age 16, where she worked under the supervision of the plantation mistress, Madame Evangeline Boudreau. What the official records did not capture were the whispered conversations among the enslaved community about Celeste's unusual constitution. Elderly slaves spoke in hushed tones about how injuries that would leave others bedridden seemed to affect her only briefly. When fellow slaves fell ill with the fever that periodically swept through the quarters, Celeste would tend to them with hands that seemed to bring comfort, though none could explain exactly how. The plantation's overseer, a man named Jeremiah Crowder, had arrived at Treme in 1858, bringing with him a reputation for harsh discipline that made even experienced plantation owners uncomfortable. Crowder's methods went beyond the casual brutality that characterized the institution of slavery. He seemed to derive satisfaction from testing the limits of human endurance, particularly with those he deemed difficult or unusual. Madame Boudreau's personal diary, discovered during a renovation of the main house in 1963, contained several references to disagreements with Crowder regarding his treatment of the household staff. One entry, dated March 1861, read, "I have spoken to Mr. Crowder again about his methods. While I understand the necessity of maintaining order, his particular interest in Celeste troubles me. She has never shown anything but complete obedience, yet he continues to subject her to punishments that seem excessive, even by our standards." The Civil War had disrupted the careful order of plantation life long before Union forces occupied New Orleans. Many of the area's wealthier families had fled north to relatives in more secure locations, leaving their properties in the hands of overseers and a skeletal staff. The Boudreau family had departed for their cousins in Natchez in early 1862, leaving Crowder in charge of a greatly reduced household staff. With the family gone, and Union patrols making only occasional sweeps of the outlying plantations, Crowder's behavior became increasingly erratic. Former slaves who survived the war later testified that he had become obsessed with what he called scientific experiments, though none could provide detailed accounts of what these experiments entailed. The few who spoke of this period described an atmosphere of fear that went beyond the normal terror of plantation life. The triggering event that led to Celeste's appearance in New Orleans began with the arrival of a stranger at the Trem plantation in late August 1862. According to later testimony from a slave named Samuel who worked in the stables, a tall man in civilian clothes arrived on horseback, carrying a leather satchel and requesting private conference with Crowder. The stranger remained for 3 days, during which time the normal routines of the plantation were suspended. Samuel recalled that during the stranger's visit, the other house slaves were forbidden from entering the main building. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney at odd hours, and strange odors drifted from the windows. On the second night, those in the quarters heard sounds that they described as neither human nor animal, though none dared investigate their source. When the stranger departed on the third day, Crowder's demeanor had changed markedly. He appeared agitated and began making preparations that suggested an imminent departure from the plantation. The remaining slaves were gathered and informed that they would be relocated to other properties, though no specifics were provided. Several slaves, including Celeste, were selected for immediate transfer to what Crowder described as special arrangements in the city. The journey from the plantation to New Orleans typically took the better part of a day by wagon. But the group traveling with Crowder made several unexplained stops. Samuel, who had been selected as the driver, later recalled that they stopped at an abandoned sugar mill approximately halfway to the city. Crowder and 2 other men who had joined their party disappeared inside the ruins for several hours, while the slaves waited in the wagon under guard. When the group emerged from the mill, Celeste was no longer with them. Crowder told the remaining slaves that she had been transferred to other arrangements and warned them against discussing her absence. The rest of the journey to New Orleans proceeded without incident, and Samuel was sold at the slave market the following day. He would not see Celeste again until after the war, when both had become part of the city's freed population. The community of New Orleans had developed its own methods of explaining events that defied conventional understanding. In a city where French Catholic traditions mixed with African spiritual practices and growing Protestant influence, unusual occurrences were often attributed to divine intervention, supernatural influence, or simple misunderstanding. When news of the strange case at the Union Medical Facility began to circulate, the initial reaction was to fit it into familiar categories. Dr. Whitfield found himself caught between his scientific training and observations that challenged everything he understood about human physiology. His medical journal from this period reflects a growing frustration with his inability to document and explain what he was witnessing. Each day brought new evidence that Celeste's healing abilities operated according to principles that existed outside conventional medical knowledge. The other medical staff at the facility initially attributed Dr. Whitfield's reports to the strain of treating wounded soldiers under difficult conditions. Army medicine during the Civil War operated under constant pressure, with limited supplies and overwhelming casualties. Misdiagnosis and confused documentation were common enough that unusual cases were often dismissed as clerical errors or physician fatigue. However, when Celeste began assisting with the care of wounded soldiers, her abilities became impossible to ignore. Soldiers who had been expected to die from their wounds showed remarkable improvement after she attended to them. Men with infected wounds that should have required amputation found their injuries healing cleanly. The medical staff began to notice that mortality rates in the ward, where Celeste worked, dropped significantly compared to other areas of the facility. Word of the unusual healing began to spread beyond the confines of the medical facility. In a city under military occupation, where normal social structures had been disrupted, stories of miraculous recovery carried particular significance. Union soldiers wrote letters to their families describing a colored woman whose touch seemed to bring healing. Confederate sympathizers whispered that divine providence was working through unlikely instruments to preserve Southern lives. The passage of time revealed the full scope of what had transpired at the plantation and the subsequent events that led to Celeste's appearance in New Orleans. As weeks passed and more soldiers experienced the inexplicable healing, Dr. Whitfield began to receive visitors who claimed knowledge of Celeste's background and the source of her abilities. The first such visitor was Father Antonin Rousseau, a Catholic priest who ministered to the city's French-speaking population. Father Rousseau brought with him a leather-bound journal that had belonged to his predecessor, Father Mathieu Landry, who had served the plantation communities upriver before his death in 1861. The journal contained extensive notes about what Father Landry had termed unusual spiritual manifestations among the enslaved population. Father Landry's journal described several cases of what he called miraculous healing among slaves, though he expressed confusion about whether these phenomena represented divine blessing or something more troubling. One entry, dated November 1860, specifically mentioned Celeste by name. The young woman continues to demonstrate healing that defies explanation. When I questioned her about the source of this ability, she spoke of dreams in which she walks through fields of light, though she cannot remember these dreams upon waking. The journal also contained detailed observations about the relationship between Celeste's healing abilities and her emotional state. Father Landry noted that her powers seemed strongest when she was caring for others who were suffering, but diminished when she herself was under stress or pain. This observation would prove crucial to understanding the events that led to her disappearance from the plantation and subsequent appearance in the city. More disturbing were Father Landry's notes about Overseer Crowder's growing interest in Celeste's abilities. The priest had visited the plantation regularly to minister to the enslaved population, and he documented his increasing concern about Crowder's treatment of those under his supervision. One entry from December 1860 read, "I have spoken with Madame Boudreau about Mr. Crowder's methods. His particular attention to Celeste troubles me greatly. He seems to view her not as a human soul in need of Christian care, but as a subject for examination." The journal's final entries, written in early 1861, revealed Father Landry's growing conviction that supernatural forces were at work on the plantation. However, his perspective on these forces had begun to shift from viewing them as divine blessing to something more ambiguous. "I begin to wonder," he wrote, "whether what we witness in Celeste represents the presence of the sacred. or whether we are seeing something that exists beyond our understanding of good and evil. From Celeste's perspective, the events that led to her presence in New Orleans began not with the stranger's arrival at the plantation, but with dreams that had haunted her since childhood. Though she could not articulate these experiences clearly, fragments of her memories revealed a consciousness that existed partially outside normal human experience. She spoke of walking through places that seemed familiar, yet impossible, of conversations with people whose faces she could not remember upon waking. The healing abilities that others found so remarkable felt natural to Celeste, though she could not explain their source or mechanism. When asked by Dr. Whitfield to describe how she knew where to place her hands or what thoughts accompanied her healing work, she could only say that she followed sensations that had no names. Her hands seemed to know where pain resided in others' bodies, and her touch carried an energy that she herself did not fully understand. The period of Crowder's increased attention had been a time of particular confusion for Celeste. The overseer had begun requesting her presence for what he called examinations that went far beyond anything she had previously experienced. These sessions, conducted in a room in the plantation's cellar that had been converted for Crowder's use, involved procedures that seemed designed to test the limits of her healing abilities. Crowder would inflict carefully controlled injuries and observe their healing process, documenting the time required for different types of wounds to close. He tested whether her abilities could be enhanced or diminished through various means, including extended periods without food or water, exposure to extreme temperatures, and forced consciousness during extended periods. The cellar room contained equipment that seemed designed for precise measurement and observation, though much of it appeared to be of unusual design. During these sessions, Celeste began to experience changes in her consciousness that went beyond the healing abilities she had always possessed. She found herself aware of sensations and experiences that belonged to others, as if the boundaries between her own consciousness and that of those around her were becoming permeable. When Crowder inflicted pain, she began to sense not only her own suffering, but also his satisfaction and the strange hunger that seemed to drive his experiments. The arrival of the stranger in late August had intensified these experiences to an almost unbearable degree. During the 3 days of his visit, Celeste found herself in a state of consciousness that seemed to exist outside normal time and space. The stranger and Crowder conducted sessions that lasted for hours, during which Celeste experienced sensations and awareness that she could not later describe coherently. She recalled feeling as though she were simultaneously in her own body and observing from outside it, aware of conversations and events occurring in multiple locations. During the final session, something fundamental had changed. The boundaries between her consciousness and the external world seemed to collapse entirely, leaving her aware of every living thing within a radius that extended far beyond the plantation. She could sense the pain of wounded soldiers in distant battles, the suffering of others subjected to similar experiments, and the vast network of human anguish that seemed to connect all conscious beings. Years after the war had ended, Samuel, the former slave who had driven the wagon to New Orleans, provided testimony that helped to clarify what had occurred during the stop at the abandoned sugar mill. Samuel had been working as a freedman in the city when he encountered Dr. Whitfield at a church gathering in 1867. When he learned of the doctor's interest in Celeste's case, he shared information that had been troubling him for years. According to Samuel's account, the sugar mill had not been abandoned when their group arrived in August 1862. Several men were present at the facility, along with equipment that seemed designed for purposes other than sugar processing. The building had been modified with additional rooms and what appeared to be medical or scientific equipment, though much of it was unlike anything Samuel had seen before. Samuel had been ordered to remain with the wagon while Crowder and his companions entered the mill with Celeste, but the thin walls of the old building allowed him to hear much of what transpired inside. He described hearing conversations about maintaining the connection and preserving the essential properties that suggested the men were following procedures they had performed before. Most disturbing were the sounds that seemed to come from Celeste herself, described as neither screams nor words, but something that conveyed suffering beyond normal human expression. When the group emerged from the mill several hours later, Celeste appeared to be unconscious. However, Samuel noticed that her breathing seemed different, as if she were in an extremely deep sleep rather than simple unconsciousness. The men discussed arrangements for her continued care, using language that suggested they expected her to remain in this state for an extended period. Rather than continuing to New Orleans with the rest of the group, Celeste was transferred to a smaller wagon that arrived during their stop at the mill. Samuel observed that this wagon was driven by a man dressed as a priest, though something about his appearance troubled Samuel in ways he could not articulate. The priest and Crowder spoke briefly in French before the transfer was completed, after which the smaller wagon departed in a direction that would take it toward New Orleans by a different route. Samuel's testimony helped Dr. Whitfield understand why Celeste had been found near the levee with no memory of her recent experiences. The period between her departure from the sugar mill and her discovery by Union soldiers represented several days that remained completely absent from her consciousness. During this time, she had apparently been in the care of individuals whose identity and purposes remained mysterious. The investigation into Celeste's background had attracted attention from sources that Dr. Whitfield had not anticipated. In early November 1862, he received a visit from a man identifying himself as Professor Edmund Hartley, who claimed to be conducting research for the Union Army's Medical Corps. Hartley presented credentials that appeared authentic, though something about his manner suggested interests that went beyond conventional medical research. Professor Hartley brought with him documentation that placed Celeste's abilities within a broader context of similar cases that had been observed in various locations throughout the South. His files contained records of other individuals who had demonstrated healing abilities that defied conventional explanation, though most of these cases had ended in ways that Professor Hartley described as unfortunate without providing specific details. According to Hartley's research, the phenomena associated with healing abilities like Celeste's tended to follow predictable patterns. The abilities typically manifested during periods of extreme stress or suffering, often in individuals who had been subjected to prolonged physical or emotional trauma. However, the abilities also seemed to require specific conditions to remain stable, and individuals who possessed them were vulnerable to what Hartley termed destabilization, if not properly managed. Hartley's documentation included detailed observations from cases in Virginia, South Carolina, and Mississippi, where individuals with similar abilities had been studied under controlled conditions. In each case, the subjects had eventually lost their abilities, often accompanied by complete mental collapse or death. The files suggested that the healing abilities represented a form of consciousness that existed at the edge of human psychological endurance. Most troubling was Hartley's assertion that the abilities were not random phenomena, but could be artificially induced through specific procedures. His research indicated that certain combinations of physical trauma, psychological manipulation, and what he termed consciousness expansion techniques could produce healing abilities in individuals who met particular criteria. However, the process was extremely dangerous and had a high failure rate. Dr. Whitfield found himself caught between his scientific curiosity and growing concern for Celeste's safety. Hartley's research suggested that her abilities were both more extraordinary and more precarious than he had realized. The professor's interest in conducting further studies raised questions about whether Celeste would be protected or exploited by continued scientific attention. The truth about the sugar mill and the network of individuals who had taken interest in cases like Celeste's began to emerge through sources that Dr. Whitfield could never have anticipated. In December 1862, he was approached by a Union intelligence officer named Captain Thomas Morrison, who brought information that placed Celeste's case within a much darker context. According to Captain Morrison's investigation, the abandoned sugar mill was part of a network of facilities throughout the South where individuals with unusual abilities were being collected and studied. The operation appeared to have connections to both Confederate intelligence efforts and certain Northern interests that remained hidden from official Union authorities. The goal seemed to be developing methods for enhancing and controlling abilities like Celeste's for potential military applications. The stranger who had visited the Tremy plantation was identified as Dr. Silas Blackwood, a physician who had been expelled from Harvard Medical School in 1858 for conducting unauthorized experiments on patients. Blackwood had disappeared shortly after his expulsion, but reports suggested that he had been continuing his research in the South, where the disruptions of war provided cover for activities that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Captain Morrison's files contained evidence that Blackwood and his associates had been operating for several years before the war, using the plantation system to identify and acquire individuals who showed evidence of unusual abilities. The network included overseers like Crowder, who had been specifically recruited for their willingness to participate in experiments, as well as physicians and researchers who had been excluded from legitimate academic institutions. The facility at the sugar mill was apparently one of several locations where subjects were taken for intensive study and experimentation. The goal was to understand the source of abilities like healing and to develop methods for transferring or replicating these abilities in others. However, the research had proven extremely dangerous, with most subjects suffering complete psychological breakdown or death during the experimental process. Celeste's case was unusual because she had retained both her abilities and her basic mental functioning, despite having been subjected to procedures that had proven fatal to others. Captain Morrison's files suggested that this resilience made her particularly valuable to Blackwood's research, but also placed her in extreme danger if she were to fall back into his hands. The revelation that had been hidden in the depths of the abandoned sugar mill began to surface through evidence that Dr. Whitfield discovered during a clandestine visit to the facility in early 1863. Acting on information provided by Captain Morrison, Dr. Whitfield and a small group of Union soldiers conducted a careful exploration of the mill and its surrounding buildings. The facility proved to be far more extensive than its external appearance suggested. Underground chambers had been excavated beneath the main building, creating a complex of rooms that had been specifically designed for medical research and experimentation. The equipment found in these chambers was both sophisticated and disturbing, including devices that seemed designed to induce and monitor extreme physiological states. Most significant was the discovery of detailed documentation that had been left behind when the facility was hastily abandoned. These files contained records of dozens of cases similar to Celeste's, along with theoretical frameworks that attempted to explain the source and nature of healing abilities. The research suggested that these abilities represented access to forms of consciousness that existed beyond normal human awareness. According to the documentation, healing abilities like Celeste's were manifestations of what the researchers termed expanded consciousness states that allowed individuals to perceive and manipulate the fundamental forces that governed biological processes. The abilities were not supernatural, but represented access to aspects of natural law that were normally beyond human awareness or control. However, the research also revealed that these expanded consciousness states were extremely unstable and could be maintained only under specific conditions. Individuals who possessed healing abilities existed in a constant state of psychological and physiological stress that made them vulnerable to complete mental collapse. The experiments conducted at the facility were attempts to understand and stabilize these states, but they had proven largely unsuccessful. The files contained detailed case studies that documented the progressive deterioration of subjects who had been studied over extended periods. In most cases, the healing abilities gradually weakened over time, accompanied by increasing mental instability and physical deterioration. The researchers had concluded that the human nervous system was not equipped to sustain the consciousness states required for healing abilities over extended periods. Most disturbing were the records indicating that researchers had developed methods for artificially inducing healing abilities in subjects who did not naturally possess them. These procedures involved systematic psychological and physical trauma designed to break down normal consciousness barriers and force access to expanded awareness states. However, artificially induced abilities were even more unstable than natural ones and inevitably resulted in complete psychological breakdown within weeks or months. During the final phase of the investigation, Dr. Whitfield discovered evidence that Celeste's abilities were beginning to deteriorate in ways that matched the patterns documented in the research files. Her healing became less consistent, sometimes failing entirely when she attempted to treat severely wounded soldiers. She began experiencing periods of disorientation during which she seemed unaware of her surroundings, as if her consciousness were operating in multiple locations simultaneously. More troubling were the changes in Celeste's emotional state. The calm acceptance that had characterized her personality began to give way to periods of intense anxiety and confusion. She spoke of dreams in which she experienced the suffering of everyone she had ever healed, as if their pain had become permanently connected to her own consciousness. Sleep became increasingly difficult, and she often remained awake for days at a time, staring into space with an expression of profound sadness. Dr. Whitfield's medical examination revealed that Celeste's physical condition was also deteriorating. Despite her remarkable healing abilities, her own body showed signs of accelerated aging and chronic exhaustion. Her heart rate and blood pressure were consistently elevated, as if she were in a constant state of physical stress. Most concerning was the evidence of neurological changes that suggested her brain was operating at levels that exceeded normal human capacity. The pattern of deterioration matched the case studies from the sugar mill almost exactly. According to the research documentation, subjects with healing abilities typically maintained their peak effectiveness for 6 to 8 months after the onset of their abilities, followed by a period of gradual decline that lasted another 6 to 12 months. The final stage involved rapid psychological collapse that was invariably fatal. Understanding that Celeste was approaching the critical phase of her deterioration, Dr. Whitfield began exploring options for helping her manage the transition. However, the research files offered little hope for preventing the ultimate collapse of her abilities and the mental breakdown that would accompany their loss. The researchers had concluded that healing abilities represented a temporary expansion of human consciousness that could not be sustained indefinitely. The resolution of Celeste's case came not through medical intervention, but through events that remained mysterious even in the extensive documentation that survived the war. In March 1863, Celeste disappeared from the Union Medical Facility under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. She had been in her assigned quarters when the night watch made their rounds at midnight, but was gone when they returned an hour later. No evidence of forced entry or struggle was found in her room, and the guards at all entrances reported no unusual activity during the night. Celeste's few possessions remained in their usual places, and her bed appeared to have been slept in, suggesting that her departure had been voluntary and unplanned. However, she left no note or message indicating her intentions or destination. Dr. Whitfield organized an extensive search of the city, focusing on areas where Celeste might have sought refuge among the freed slave population. However, despite the cooperation of community leaders and religious organizations, no trace of her could be found. It was as if she had simply vanished without leaving any evidence of her passage. Several weeks after her disappearance, Dr. Whitfield received a letter that had been delivered by an unknown messenger. The letter was written in Celeste's handwriting, though the style and content were unlike anything she had previously produced. The message was brief, but clear. She had chosen to leave in order to prevent the deterioration and collapse that she knew was approaching. She thanked Dr. Whitfield for his care and asked him not to search for her. The letter also contained information that suggested Celeste had gained access to knowledge about her condition that she had not possessed before. She wrote of understanding the true nature of her abilities and the reasons why they could not be sustained indefinitely. Most intriguingly, she mentioned having made contact with others who shared similar experiences and who had found ways to manage the transition process. Years later, Dr. Whitfield would receive occasional reports of healing incidents in various locations throughout the South that bore similarities to Celeste's abilities. However, these reports were always fragmentary and impossible to verify. It seemed that individuals with healing abilities had learned to operate in ways that avoided the attention that had made Celeste's case so well documented. The final documentation of Celeste's case came in the form of a letter that Dr. Whitfield received in 1867, 4 years after her disappearance. The letter was postmarked from a small town in rural Louisiana, though the return address proved to be fictitious when Dr. Whitfield attempted to respond. The handwriting was recognizably Celeste's, and though it showed signs of strain and fatigue. In the letter, Celeste provided a final account of her experiences and the resolution of her unusual circumstances. She wrote that the healing abilities had indeed continued to deteriorate after her departure from New Orleans, following the pattern that Dr. Whitfield had predicted. However, she had discovered that the loss of these abilities was not necessarily accompanied by the mental collapse that the research had suggested was inevitable. According to her account, she had made contact with a small community of individuals who had possessed similar abilities and had successfully managed the transition back to normal human consciousness. This community operated in secret, helping others who found themselves in similar circumstances to navigate the dangerous period during which their expanded awareness gradually returned to normal limits. The process was not without its difficulties. Celeste described experiencing periods of profound disorientation and loss as her consciousness contracted back to normal human boundaries. The ability to sense and heal the suffering of others gradually faded, leaving her feeling isolated and diminished. However, the community had developed techniques for managing this transition that prevented the psychological breakdown that typically accompanied the loss of these abilities. Most significantly, Celeste reported that she had retained certain aspects of her expanded awareness even after her healing abilities had completely disappeared. She remained sensitive to the emotional states of others and possessed an intuitive understanding of human suffering that allowed her to provide comfort and guidance without the dramatic healing abilities that had made her case so remarkable. The letter concluded with Celeste's reflection on the meaning of her experiences. She had come to understand her healing abilities not as a supernatural gift, but as a temporary access to aspects of human consciousness that normally remained hidden. The abilities had allowed her to experience the fundamental interconnectedness of all conscious beings, though the human nervous system was not equipped to sustain this awareness indefinitely. She expressed gratitude for the period during which she had been able to ease the suffering of others, but also relief at having returned to a more normal state of consciousness. The expanded awareness that had enabled her healing abilities had also forced her to experience the full scope of human pain and suffering, a burden that had become increasingly difficult to bear as time passed. The trail of documentation surrounding Celeste's case continued for several more years through scattered reports and official records that suggested the network of researchers who had taken interest in healing abilities had continued to operate after the war. Union intelligence files from the Reconstruction period contained references to ongoing investigations into what were termed anomalous healing incidents that were believed to be connected to the wartime experiments. However, these later cases seemed to follow a different pattern than Celeste's experience. The individuals involved typically displayed healing abilities for much shorter periods and often suffered the psychological breakdown that Celeste had somehow avoided. This suggested that the techniques developed by the research network had not improved significantly, or that the conditions that had allowed Celeste to survive her experiences were unique and difficult to replicate. By 1870, official interest in these cases had largely disappeared as the federal government focused on other priorities of Reconstruction. The files were archived and forgotten, and the network of researchers who had operated during the war either died or moved on to other pursuits. The extraordinary circumstances that had allowed cases like Celeste's to be documented and studied had passed with the end of the war and the return to normal social conditions. Dr. Whitfield continued his medical practice in New Orleans until his death in 1885, but he never again encountered cases that approached the extraordinary nature of Celeste's healing abilities. His detailed documentation of her case became part of the medical archives of the city, where it remained filed and largely unnoticed for decades. The circumstances that had made such cases possible seemed to have been unique to the disrupted social conditions of the Civil War period. The final chapter in the documented history of Celeste's case came through the discovery of additional materials during renovation work on several buildings in New Orleans during the 1960s. Among the items found in sealed storage areas were additional letters and documents that provided glimpses into the later history of the healing abilities phenomenon and the fate of those who had been involved in studying it. These materials suggested that the community Celeste had described in her final letter had continued to exist for several decades after the war, operating as an underground network that helped individuals with unusual abilities manage their circumstances safely. The community had developed sophisticated understanding of the consciousness states associated with healing abilities and had created support systems that prevented the psychological breakdown that had claimed so many subjects during the wartime experiments. However, the materials also indicated that the abilities themselves had become increasingly rare as social conditions stabilized and the extreme circumstances that seemed to trigger their development became less common. By the end of the 19th century, documented cases of healing abilities had virtually disappeared, suggesting that these phenomena were closely connected to specific historical and social conditions that had passed with the end of the Civil War era. The documents included testimonials from several individuals who had possessed healing abilities and had successfully transitioned back to normal consciousness with the help of the community Celeste had described. These accounts provided evidence that the dire predictions of the wartime researchers had been based on incomplete understanding of the phenomena they were studying. When provided with proper support and guidance, individuals could survive the loss of their extraordinary abilities without suffering the psychological collapse that the researchers had considered inevitable. Among the final documents was what appeared to be a letter from Celeste herself, dated 1878, and addressed to Dr. Whitfield, though apparently never sent. In this letter, she provided a final reflection on her experiences and the lessons they had taught her about the nature of human consciousness and suffering. She wrote of having found peace in her return to normal awareness and in the work she had been able to do, helping others navigate similar transitions. The letter revealed that Celeste had spent the final years of her life working as a midwife and healer in rural Louisiana, using the understanding she had gained from her extraordinary experiences to provide comfort and care to others, without relying on the dramatic abilities that had once defined her existence. She had married and raised children, living a life that was outwardly ordinary, but informed by the profound insights she had gained during her period of expanded consciousness. She concluded by expressing hope that the documentation of her case would someday be useful to others who might find themselves experiencing similar phenomena. She emphasized that healing abilities, while remarkable, were not in themselves the goal of human consciousness, but rather a temporary glimpse of potentials that existed within all human beings. The true significance of her experiences lay not in the abilities themselves, but in the understanding they had provided of the fundamental interconnectedness of all conscious life. The story of Celeste's healing abilities and the network of researchers who had studied her case remained buried in archives and forgotten files for nearly a century. It was only in the 1960s, when civil rights workers and historians began researching the experiences of enslaved people during the Civil War, that the documentation began to surface and receive serious scholarly attention. Even then, the extraordinary nature of the claims made it difficult to determine where historical fact ended and legend began. Dr. Whitfield's medical journal, discovered during the renovation of a New Orleans hospital in 1963, provided the most detailed and credible account of healing abilities that had ever been documented. The journal's clinical observations and careful documentation made it impossible to dismiss the case as folklore or exaggeration, though the phenomena described remained as impossible to explain as they had been a century earlier. Modern medical researchers who examined the documentation found themselves in the same position as Dr. Whitfield had been during the Civil War. The evidence for extraordinary healing abilities was compelling and detailed, but the mechanisms that might have enabled such abilities remained completely outside the boundaries of conventional medical understanding. The case stood as a reminder that human consciousness and its potential abilities remained far more mysterious than mainstream science was prepared to acknowledge. The final mystery surrounding Celeste's case concerned the ultimate fate of the woman whose abilities had created such extensive documentation. Despite the detailed records of her experiences during the Civil War and the letters that provided glimpses of her later life, no definitive record of her death or final years was ever discovered. The trail of evidence simply faded away sometime during the 1880s, leaving her ultimate destiny as mysterious as the source of her extraordinary abilities had been. Some historians suggested that this absence of final documentation was itself significant, reflecting the degree to which Celeste and others like her had learned to live outside the boundaries of official record-keeping. Having experienced the dangers of attracting attention for their unusual abilities, they had apparently developed sophisticated methods for maintaining privacy and avoiding the documentation that had made Celeste's wartime case so thoroughly recorded. Yet the mystery persisted, leaving later researchers to wonder whether individuals with healing abilities continued to exist in modern times, operating with the same careful secrecy that had characterized the community Celeste had described in her letters. The possibility remained that the phenomena documented during the Civil War had not disappeared, but had simply learned to avoid the attention that had made their earlier existence so well documented. Today, the archived materials related to Celeste's case remain filed in various historical collections throughout the South, available to researchers but largely unknown to the general public. The documentation stands as testimony to possibilities within human consciousness that mainstream understanding has yet to acknowledge or explain. Whether such abilities still exist, hidden within communities that have learned to protect their secrets, remains one of the enduring mysteries of human potential. The sound that still echoes through the empty rooms of the Beauregard mansion, now a museum in New Orleans' French Quarter, is not the echo of healing hands or miraculous recovery. It is the quieter sound of human suffering, transformed not through impossible abilities, but through the simple recognition of our fundamental connection to one another. In rooms where once the impossible seemed routine, visitors occasionally report a sense of profound peace that has no obvious source, as if the building itself retained some memory of the extraordinary compassion that had once operated within its walls. Perhaps the true mystery of Celeste's story lies not in the healing abilities that made her case so remarkable, but in the possibility that the consciousness she accessed during her brief period of expanded awareness represents a potential that exists within all human beings. The extraordinary circumstances of the Civil War may have created conditions that allowed this potential to manifest in dramatic ways, but the fundamental capacity for healing, both physical and emotional, through deep recognition of our shared humanity, remains available to anyone willing to bear witness to the suffering of others. The archives remain open to those who seek them, filled with testimony to possibilities that conventional understanding continues to reject. Yet the questions raised by Celeste's case persist, challenging our assumptions about the limits of human consciousness and the nature of healing itself. In a world where the impossible occasionally proves to be merely improbable, the story of a slave girl whose touch could heal stands as a reminder that the boundaries of human potential may be far more fluid than we dare to imagine.